My talk today is essentially a overview or synopsis of a massive 80-page thing that I stuck on my academia.edu page. So if anyone is interested in a lot more detail on this, and especially some of the more complex philological calculations and deductions that I've made, I would recommend that people turn to that. And so today I'll just give a brief overview of that and try to leave enough time so that we can talk about some of the things that I say here. Okay, I think I'm ready to move on to the next slide. So, as the title of my talk indicates, I'm going to try to give a little bit of information on Piṇḍo, who Dorjila has already discussed. First of all, we have to specify that the form of the name, the Indic form of the name Piṇḍo, is not attested in any Indic work thus far. Now, there's a possibility that we will get a text in Sanskrit, or it will become available, which would resolve perhaps the problem that I've explored in depth about just the mere name of this person. But for the time being, that manuscript is in Tibet. Who knows when it will become available to the international scholarly community. So in any case, I have reconstructed, and not myself alone, a number of Tibetan sources take the Tibetan word Tsongkhapa as representing Piṇḍo in Indic. The lexicography of this is extremely complicated. Prior scholars have very often reconstructed Tsongkhapa as Piṇḍapāṭaka or Piṇḍapāṭaka, which is a commonly used epithet or descriptor of a person, usually a monk or nun, who goes on alms rounds. So it means something like an almsman or a mendicant. But I think that's incorrect. Among the scholars that had previously reconstructed Tsongkhapa as Piṇḍapāṭaka, we have people like Jean Nadeau and David Seyfort Ruegg especially. And Ruegg, I think, was very influential in influencing other people to assume that the Indic underlying Tsongkhapa was in fact Piṇḍapāṭaka. But there are a number of reasons that I'll go into a little bit of detail why Piṇḍo is more likely. Chief among these, well, it has to do with the way Atisha refers to Tsongkhapa in his Ratna Karandodgata, Madhyamaka Shastra, and as well as in the Bodhipatra commentary. We'll get into that in a minute. But based upon the way Tsongkhapa appears in Atisha's works, and then as well as the way Tibetan historians and lineages present the name, I take it as fairly, with some confidence, that the underlying Indic here is Piṇḍo. Okay, now Piṇḍo's homeland, I think, can be established with a fair degree of certainty as Java. That is, Atisha refers, as Dorjila mentioned, Atisha in the Bodhipatra commentary uses we have a transliteration of it in Tibetan script as Yavadvipa. There doesn't seem to be any real problem with that. Okay, this raises the question, though, of the relationship between Piṇḍo of Java, which in Tibetan would be Tsongkhapa Yavadvipa, versus Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, Serlingpa Chögyal Drakpa. Some scholars have essentially conflated these two individuals, treating them as if they were a single individual. I try to provide evidence to suggest that that is a mistake, and I think it's a rather serious mistake, because if we're able to establish that Atisha had two gurus who were from Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia, then that has significant ramifications for our understanding of, on the one hand, Atisha's study with these teachers, and then on the other hand, the presence of these Southeast Asian teachers in northeastern India during the time of Atisha, basically the latter part of the 10th century and into the 11th century. So I'll just move on from that, and maybe we'll return to it a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, as far as the name Piṇḍo of Java in Atisha's works, we're given multiple epithets of this master, a total of 6 references to him. This one time in the Ratnakarandodgata, and 5 times, if I'm remembering correctly, in the Bodhipatthapadipa commentary. So he refers to, we have references to Sunyompa 6 times in each of these 6 references. In 3 of the references, Atisha refers to Sunyompa or Piṇḍo as my guru, Daki Lama Gyurpa. And to me, that's significant because he's not, and we would get that anyway from the general context of his discussion of Piṇḍo's ideas, that Atisha got his understanding of Atisha's teachings, Atisha got his understanding of Piṇḍo's teachings directly from Piṇḍo. He was a direct teacher, not a lineage guru, someone from the past. And then 3 times Atisha refers to him with the generic title of Lama or Guru. In 5 of the instances, Piṇḍo is referenced as a Gelong bhikshu, and then once only, and that's significant, I think, he's referred to as Avaduti. Avaduti is a Tibetan transliteration which rather inaccurately represents the Sanskrit Avaduta. Avaduti is, of course, one of the names of the central channel within the subtle body. And that's, Francesco Sfera pointed out to me that that's never used as an epithet for a person in Sanskrit. Rather, the epithet, which is commonly attested not only in Buddhist sources, but in non-Buddhist sources as well, is Avaduta. So, and I was able to track down at least one case where the Tibetans had represented the Sanskrit Avaduta as Avaduti. Minor point, but something that people should keep in mind probably. Okay, moving on from that, Atisha refers to him 3 times, to Piṇḍo 3 times as Yawadvipa, and Yawadvipa, there are variations in the spelling, but I don't think they're significant in the Tibetan texts. And Yawadvipa might be a Tibetan transliterations of an underlying Sanskrit Yawadvipiya, or perhaps possibly Yawadvipaka, another way to indicate a person or a thing that came from a place. But I don't have any evidence of that directly. So I refer to Piṇḍo as of Yawadvipa alone. Okay, then finally at the bottom of this slide here, there's one case in the Bodhipatthapadipa Punjika or commentary where Atisha refers to Sunyompa or Piṇḍo as Sunyo. The text here is extremely problematic, and I would not be able to go into all the details of this. In fact, I wrote a page and a half or 2 pages on this emendation that I made to the Bodhipatthapadipa commentary. I reduce the reference that appears in that text to Serlingpa. I change it to Nelingpa. And I understand that to be a translation, Tibetan translation of Yavadvipa or Yavadvipiya or Yavadvipaka. But in any case, I considered that to be a editorial insertion into the text, and I want to get rid of that and have Atisha refer to Piṇḍo as a person of Yavadvipa in all cases. We can get into the details of that later if people are interested. But this is significant because it looks like in that passage as if Atisha is referring to Piṇḍo as Serlingpa, and I think that's wrong. I think that's some kind of confusion that appears in the text. So keep that in mind. Thank you. Next slide, please. So as far as Piṇḍo's dates, they're primarily derivative of Atisha's dates, which have been fairly securely established. I'm not so sure about the birth date, but it's commonly accepted that Atisha was born in approximately 982, passed away approximately or probably in 1054. That's probably a fairly secure date. So as far as Piṇḍo's dates, they're derivative from Atisha's dates. For an antequem, we can use the references in Atisha's works, as well as the translation of the Kālacakra Garbhālaṅkara, because that was translated by Gyō Dawe User and Sri Bhadra Bodhi. It dates to the first half of the 11th century. So given we have a translation of one of Piṇḍo's works, then it's clear that he flourished around that time. As far as the postquem, we know that he taught Atisha, and also he used in the Kālacakra Garbhālaṅkara the Sri Kālacakra, the Laghu Tantra of the Kālacakra tradition, as well as the Vimalaprabha. So therefore, we know that he was using those works, which, and I would make a minor correction to my own previous statement on this. I believe that the Sri Kālacakra and the Vimalaprabha reached completion between about 1025 and 1040. Not that they were composed during that short time period. So I assume that these texts actually were created over a period of time, maybe a few decades, but they achieved completion during that brief time frame, 15-year time frame between 1025 and 1040 approximately. So as far as Piṇḍo's demise is concerned, or his dates, I would say he perhaps was born in the first part of the second half of the 10th century, and maybe he passed away prior to 1040. That would assume that he was older than Atisha and that he predeceased Atisha's departure to Tibet. This latter assumption is very tenuous. Don't rely on it, but it's somewhere in the ballpark, I would suspect. And in any case, we can establish his period of his fleuret around the late 10th to the early 11th century, which coincides with my theoretical reconstruction of the origins of the Kālacakra Tantra. Okay, next. Okay, as far as his doctrinal positions, I'll skate over this fairly rapidly because time is passing. But Atisha, whenever he refers to Piṇḍo in both the Ratnakarandodgata as well as the Bodhipatra, it's always about Mantrayana. He never cites Piṇḍo, to my knowledge at least, having to do with general Mahayana doctrine. It's always specifically Vajrayāna doctrine, Mantranaya, Mantrayana doctrine. Piṇḍo is a strong advocate of Mantrayana and especially Mahamudra. He says basically, if you're a Pandita, you would be an imbecile if you do not follow Mantrayana and specifically do not follow Mahamudra. Now, what does he mean by Mahamudra? Well, that is an interesting question. Based upon the Kālacakra garb alamkara, I would say that, it's Mahamudra as it is represented in the Kālacakra system. That kind of makes sense given Atisha's references to him as well. Next issue, which is extremely complicated, and I've spent, I don't know, 20 pages on it or something in that paper. He was an opponent of the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna abhishekas for celibates. That seems to be clear to me. There's some wiggle room on this because the Kālacakra text that I've cited in the paper, there's places where they seem a little bit ambiguous. But in general, it looks like Atisha is simply reporting Piṇḍo's position that the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna abhishekas cannot be taken by celibates, period. That position probably was something of an outlier within late Vajrayāna Buddhism. But in order to really get to the bottom of that, to see where Piṇḍo's position lies within the general context of Vajrayāna initiation practices during the latter part of Vajrayāna Buddhism in India, you'd have to dig deeper. I've tried to do a little bit of that in my paper, but there's a lot more to be done on this. Okay, next, as Dorjila mentioned, Atisha cites Piṇḍo as his authority for the Adibuddha Tantra prohibition in the Bodhipatra Pradipa, this famous, towards the end of the Bodhipatra Pradipa, the prohibition of celibates taking the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna abhishekas, which involves sexual activity, which would compromise one's celibacy, according to Piṇḍo at least. However, it's sometimes been represented as if, first of all, that this is Atisha's idea, and that's simply wrong, because Atisha is reporting his guru's position within the Bodhipatra Pradipa. He's not, whether this is Atisha's own position is another complicated question. He presents it as authoritative, but when you read the overall treatment of this, it's not exactly clear to me, at least, that Atisha comes down absolutely on that side, that celibates cannot take the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna abhishekas. Again, a very complicated can of worms, big problem that would have to be investigated further. However, it's quite clear that Piṇḍo says that Adikarmikas, which here refers to neophyte bodhisattvas, and I put in brackets there lay bodhisattvas, are allowed to take the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna abhishekas. This is quite clear. So, and there's a passage in the Bodhipatra Pradipa commentary where Atisha references Piṇḍo's position on this, and according to Atisha's representation of this, Piṇḍo says some lay people don't need to take these initiations, but some lay people are the opposite of that, meaning that they do apparently need to take these initiations. So there's a lot of nuance embedded in this issue. It's been extensively studied by Isabella Onions in her dissertation, which I recently just got access to, so I'm not able to comment much about on what she said, but I used it a little bit in the paper, and anyone who's interested in this should refer to that. Finally, on this point, Piṇḍo's position appears to agree with the early Kālacakra literature. That is, some scholars have come to the conclusion that it's not in the Kālacakra, but I think that's incorrect. If you take the where Atisha cites the Adi-Buddha Tantra, or the Great Adi-Buddha Tantra. That's a generic term. It's not a specific text. And I think that is in reference to the system as a whole. And thus that Atisha got his understanding of the Adi-Buddha Tantra, the Kālacakra, from Piṇḍo, and that is what is being represented in the Bodhipatra Pradipa itself, as well as in the commentary to that. So in the paper, I've dredged up several references in from the Kālacakra literature, which seem to show quite clearly, one of which does show quite clearly that Bodhisattva Vajrapani's Lagu Tantra Tika. That clearly shows that celibates are not allowed to take the Guhya and the Prajñāñāna Abhishekas. So to me, that's crystal clear. Some of the other evidence drawn from the Sri Kālacakra and the Vimala Prabha, maybe there's one place where it's unclear, but I simply have to move on from that and refer you to that paper for maybe too much discussion of this. Okay, next. Okay, in terms of Piṇḍo's doctrinal positions, it's all basically Vajrayāna, but of course Vajrayāna is part of Mahayana, so he's drawing on a wide range of general Mahayana works, as well as common Shravakayana texts. It's the general picture you get from late Indian Buddhism, where these Mahapanditas had basically read everything, they knew everything, and they blended together in their own distinctive ways. This is reflected in the one work which we can assign without much question to Piṇḍo, and that's the Kālacakra Garbhalamkara Nama Sadhana. That's the title that I'm using for this. Again, in the paper, I talk about how the exciting fact that this may be extant in Sanskrit in Tibet. If it becomes available, it will undoubtedly significantly modify our understanding of Piṇḍo's ideas. But looking at it through the lens of the Tibetan translation, which was done by Gyjo Dawe User and Sri Bhadra Bodhi. So it's one of these really early Kālacakra translation works. We have the canonical versions of it in the Dengir, as well as an extra canonical Ume manuscript in the Dunkor Chokrik Chimo. I haven't used that very much. I've mainly been reading the Dengir version of it, which seems pretty good. But anyway, in terms of doctrine, it's a blend of doctrine and practice for the Kālacakra. Despite the title, which, it's got sadhana in the title, but this is not an utpati krama sadhana with dakye, atmotpati, that kind of thing, where you're generating yourself as a deity and then doing the rituals and meditations and so forth. That's not what this is. This is more like a prakarana, a kind of exposition of doctrine bearing upon practice. And it's a very interesting text. I highly recommend it to anyone interested in this topic. In terms of his doctrinal positions, he presents a Madhyamaka version of Chittamatra, and he gives a very interesting argument that consciousness is singular, quoting the Lankavatara Sutra and other works to defend this position. He cites quite a few scriptures and commentarial authorities. He also gives a guru lineage, and those interested in that I talk about this in the written version of this of the paper. So I'll just move on from that. Next. Okay, this, as Dorjila mentioned, Piṇḍo in Indo-Tibetan historiography and hagiography. Extremely complex and confusing. That is putting it mildly. The sources for this seem to be growing like mushrooms every day almost. That's an exaggeration, but not much. There's a massive literature that the Tibetans produced on this. You have to stratify it by date in order to really get any traction on it, because it's a massive confusion. I'm boiling it down here to a couple of essential points. In the Ra tradition, Raluk, Piṇḍo is the second non-mythic guru. And I think Ian Sinclair mentioned that the first guru in this lineage is called Tsilu in Tibetan, or Chilu, if you indicize that, Indic, made it Indic, or Chilupā. Some people have misidentified Chilu as if it was Tilo. There's no reason to do that. I think that's just a sidetrack going nowhere. But in any case, Piṇḍo is the second non-mythic guru in the Ra tradition lineage. In the Dro tradition lineage, as this is recorded by Budun and others, Piṇḍo does not even appear. I have constructed an argument for which there is some evidence, it's not purely my imagination, that Piṇḍo, or rather Kulkan Sripala, who's one of the Kulkans of Shambhala, is a alias of Piṇḍo, and that's where Piṇḍo appears in the Dro tradition guru lineage. So to boil it down to its essence, in my very shaky and constructed theory, Piṇḍo had a couple of aliases, one of which was Kālacakra, and sometimes he is specified as Kālacakra the Great, Dugikoro Shapchambo, and he also was known as Kulkan Sripala. Finally, in this point, two Kālacakra masters who wrote on the Kālacakra, Sunam User, about whom we know very little other than that his account of the Kālacakra was recorded by Gelukpa in the Depter Ngumpo, the Blue Annals, and Taranatha as well, as Dorje mentioned. Both held that Piṇḍo is the person who, quote, introduced. Chendrang is an honorific form meaning to introduce or to invite, introduce the Kālacakra in India. I had sort of come to this conclusion decades ago. When I read this in Taranatha originally, it was like, oh, so he thinks so too. Great, I'm glad to have somebody else that believes this. And then later I found out that Sunam Usa, this early master, also said that. And then likewise, when you read Gur Lotsawa Shunupel carefully, it looks like he singles out Piṇḍo as being a likely candidate, or at least someone that we can isolate as an early master in the Kālacakra tradition that you can establish some facts about. Because otherwise, when you look at the mass of legends about the introduction of the Kālacakra in India, it's just chaos. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, conclusions and questions. Piṇḍo was definitely an early, I would argue, first generation master of the Kālacakra. That seems to be more or less established fact, primarily due to Atisha's usage of his ideas or reproduction of his ideas, as well as the translation of the Kālacakra Garbhālamkara. So also I make the case that Piṇḍo of Java and Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa are two different gurus from that part of the world that Atisha studied under. That to me seems to be fairly well established. So this raises the thorny question of, did Atisha actually go to Suvarnadvipa or instead study under Southeast Asian gurus in northeastern India? I have an appendix in the paper that I've mentioned that I tend to follow Helmut Eimer, who presented this quite, he raised the issue. He said, given the fact it appears that Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa was in northeastern India at some point, Eimer made the inference that maybe Atisha studied under Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa in northeastern India. Subsequently, other scholars have pointed out, I'm forgetting his name now, Gregory Seaton, I believe. But anyway, Seaton produced a dissertation on Ratnakara Shanti, in which he makes the case that Ratnakara Shanti studied under Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, and that Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa was Ratnakara Shanti's main guru even. I'm not sure about that, but regardless, if it is the case that Ratnakara Shanti studied under Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa and Atisha studied under Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, it seems simplest to make the case that Atisha might have studied under Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa in India rather than having gone to Southeast Asia. Open question, we can argue about this probably at great length. Regardless, there's strong evidence that Piṇḍo of Java was in Northeast India during the 10th to 11th century. And if Atisha studied under two people from that part of the world, it may very well be the case that he did so in northeastern India. So issues for further research, well, there's a lot of them. Here's a couple. One thing that I hope to do at some point is dig deeper into the Kālacakra Garbhalamkara and compare its ideas with the rest of the massive Indic Kālacakra literature, and then further investigation of whether Piṇḍo is hidden under the aliases that were adopted by the foundational Kālacakra authors. That means Bodhisattva Vajrapani, Bodhisattva Vajragarbha, Dharmaraja Suchandra, Kulkin Yashas, Kulkin Pundarika, and so forth. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, the revealed literature of the Kālacakra is ascribed to bodhisattvas, 10th stage bodhisattvas, who have the names Vajrapani, Vajragarbha, Pundarika, as well as kings of Shambhala, the king of Shambhala, Dharmaraja Suchandra, and the Kulkins of Shambhala, Yashas and Pundarika. So these are clearly mythic names that were adopted by the authors of these texts. The main problem in getting grounding this literature historically is trying to determine to what extent we can figure out who the actual authors of these texts were, and to situate them in time and space, the basic problems of historians. And that hopefully some of the younger people in the audience and people working with Francesco Sfera and the people in Hamburg, hopefully they'll answer these questions and maybe explain all of this stuff to me. But I think I'll stop there and leave it open the floor to any questions or comments. Thanks.